I'm delighted to say that here at RUSI, we continue to have a very close relationship with the British Army. Our annual Land Warfare Conference provides, I think, the preeminent forum for discussion of land warfare issues in the UK each year. We continue to support conceptual development through our Agile Warrior programme with the Army, and starting in 3 months' time we're going to have a visiting fellow from the Army based in RUSI alongside our researchers. And I certainly, from those experiences, know the way in which, especially over the last 3 to 4 years, the spirit of innovation and agility in our Army is really remarkable to see. There is, I think, a realization, an intellectual realization of the new challenges that are faced, particularly but not only in relation to Russian developments, a real creativity and a real desire to move forward and to create an army that's relevant for the new challenges our country faces. And I especially appreciate the fact that we've got General Sir Nick here as one of the leaders, one of the thought leaders, if you like, pressing the Army to do more, to change. In many ways, we're at the beginning of a process of adaptation and modernisation, not at its conclusion. Now, I know there's a well-worn custom in this country that we're all used to reading about speeches before they're actually made. And selective elements of speeches are trailed in all our mass media, and it almost seems quaint to comment on speeches after they're made. But my own experience is that there is no substitute for reading speeches in their entirety and listening to the answers to the questions that are posed in relation to those speeches. And I'm sure that's even more so in this case with General Sir Nick and his contribution. The format is you will speak for somewhere around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have around 15 or 20 minutes for discussion and Q&A thereafter. And as I said, this will all be on the record. CGS, over to you.
Now, Malcolm, thank you for those kind words of introduction. And good evening, everybody. It's good to be with you, and it's particularly good to see so many friendly faces in the audience. In Parliament last week, the Defence Secretary explained that the analysis of threats in the 2015 Strategic Defence and Security Review remained sound. But he did observe that these threats had diversified and become more serious, and at a faster pace than we expected. Hence, the government initiated the National Security Capability Review last July, which for defence remains ongoing, and I think, contrary to speculation, no decisions have yet been made. I'm very grateful, therefore, to be given the chance this evening to elaborate on the threats and what I believe we should be doing about it, and hopefully to create some debate. And a particular thanks to RUSI for hosting us this evening. Now, in terms of threats, I shall start with international terrorism. It seems to me that significant progress has been made against Daesh in Iraq and Syria, and the prospects of a caliphate on the ground have been defeated. The threat from international terrorism, though, has diversified and is more dispersed, and we see the phenomenon that Daesh represents emerging in other parts of the world. And of course, we've learned, sadly, over the last few years, that anyone can become a terrorist these days simply by renting a vehicle or wielding a machete. Terrorism is clearly a very significant threat to our country. In the short term, it is vital that we protect our population, while recognising that the long-term solution is to fix the causes of it, which are invariably a lack of education, a lack of opportunity, and a growing feeling of exclusion and isolation. Often, I suspect, coupled with a lack of opportunity and therefore a sense of impotence. This is a worry in many European countries, but in the Middle East and North Africa, when local politics, regional dynamics and the geopolitical situation are overlaid, it becomes a wicked problem, resulting, I suspect, in a complicated tapestry of factors, with extremist groups exploiting the chaos to seize territory and carve out an even larger foothold for themselves, whence to launch attacks, including recruiting and inspiring our own citizens to acts of terror. The next threat I would touch on, I think, are the longer-term implications of population movement and how that might affect the stability and the cohesion of our society. Looking specifically at Africa, according to the United Nations, Africa is expected to account for more than half the world's population growth between 2015 and 2050. Nearly all of this growth will be among the 49 countries of sub-Saharan Africa, some 2 billion people by 2045. By then, more than half of Africans will be living in cities, and this group will be mostly young people connected through mobile devices. Without economic growth matching population growth, it's inevitable that we will see more movement. But I think it is the rising threat from states and the consequences that stem from this for the military that is of most immediate concern, and particularly to me as the head of the army. We now live in a much more competitive, multipolar world, and the complex nature of the global system has created the conditions in which states are able to compete in new ways, short of what we would have defined as war in the past. It is what US Defense Secretary Mattis described last week as great power competition. I quote, "We will continue to prosecute the campaign against terrorists that we're engaged in today, but great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of US national security." And I think, viewed from his perspective, with increasing competition in the South China Sea, the potential grave consequences of North Korea's nuclear program, the arms race and proxy wars that you see playing out in Yemen and Syria that perhaps stem from Iran's regional aspirations, with Russia, the most complex and capable security challenge we have faced since the Cold War, superimposed on much of it. It would be difficult, I think, on that basis, not to agree with Jim Mattis's assessment. Worrying, though, all of these states have become masters at exploiting the seams between peace and war. What constitutes a weapon in this grey area no longer has to go bang. Energy, cash as bribes, corrupt business practices, cyber attacks, assassination, fake news, propaganda, and indeed military intimidation are all examples of the weapons used to gain advantage in this era of constant competition. And the rules-based international architecture that has assured our stability and prosperity since 1945 is, I suggest, therefore threatened. Now, this is not a crisis or a series of crises which we face. Rather, it is a strategic challenge, and I think it requires a strategic response. The deduction that we should draw from this is that there is no longer two clear, distinct states of peace and war. We now have several forms. Indeed, the character of war and peace is different for each of the contexts in which these weapon systems are applied. And the risk we run in not defining this clearly and acting accordingly is that, rather like a chronic contagious disease, it will creep up on us, and our ability to act will be markedly constrained, and we'll be the losers of this competition. The arch exponent of this is Russia, as described by the Prime Minister in her Mansion House speech last autumn. I said earlier, I believe it represents the most complex and capable state-based threat to our country since the end of the Cold War. And my fellow Chiefs of Staff from the United States, France and Germany shared this view at last year's RUSI Land Warfare Conference. Now, in the military, we analyse threats on the basis of capability and intent. So let's just examine Russian capability for a moment and how they are applying it. Of course, we mustn't interpret what we see as a revival of Russian Cold War practice, nor look at the Crimean operation alone. They have no single model for conflict with NATO. They use a multi-model approach, utilising conventional, unconventional, and nuclear domains. A hybrid version that might involve little green men, big green tanks, and huge green missiles. Their thinking is very flexible. Their general staff is able to change, evolve, learn lessons with agility. For example, they know that demography is not on their side, so they are developing capability that needs fewer men. For example, missiles, drones, and two-man tanks. They have developed coherent concepts for equipment and training that are focused on our vulnerabilities. For example, our dependency on communications and IT, our lack of massed fires, and perhaps our lack of investment in air defence. They apply a ruthless focus on defeating their opponents, not seizing ground for the sake of it, but making sure that our vital ground is denied to us. And I shall return to missile capability in a moment. Since 2016, we have seen a marked shift to cyber, to subversion and to coercion, as well as sophisticated use of smear campaigns and fake news. Whether you believe in interference in the US democratic process or the attempted coup in Montenegro, they are very easily examples of this. Now, Chris Donnelly at the Institute for Statecraft suggests that they are creating new strategic conditions. Their current influence and disinformation campaign is a form of system warfare that seeks to delegitimize the political and social system on which our military strength is based. And this undermines our centre of gravity, which they rightly assess as our political cohesion. And Russian overtures to Turkey are a clear indication of this. Now, this system warfare has to be defeated. One has to recognise the importance of messaging one's intent and the importance of deterrence. Their doctrine for war utilises all of the instruments of national power, not just the military. They believe that any shooting war must be finished quickly if it is to be successful. Their instinct will be to escalate and to speed up the tempo of operations. To avoid being surprised, they believe in preemption without long mobilisation, and they will do something that their opponent least expects. They have used Syria to develop an expeditionary capability, to give very large numbers of their officers the high-end war-fighting experience they had not been able to get in Ukraine, and to combat test their long-range strike missiles and over 150 different new weapons and items of equipment. Their conventional military posture gives them a calculable military advantage. They operate on interior lines with a very capable rail and transportation network. We saw that during last year's Zapad exercise and how effective it is. And they believe in connecting their strategic zones, the West, the Arctic, the Black Sea and the Far East, and rapidly switching forces between them. In the last 5 years, the number of air, maritime and land-based platforms for long-range missiles has increased by a factor of 12. That's in the last 5 years. And Gerasimov spoke last November about how they had increased the number of missiles with a range of up to 4,000 kilometres by a factor of 30. This gives them the capability to create mobile missile domes, shields, in which they can assure their freedom to manoeuvre and deny us the ability to act. This is what we call anti-access area denial. And we've seen this in Syria with their capacity to seal airspace over significant distances. They use electronic warfare at scale to cue precise targeting by large numbers of drones that enable very accurate and instantaneous fires, including thermobaric warheads, to destroy an opponent's forces. And we've seen this in Ukraine. And during last year's Zapad exercises, they used the opportunity to suppress and, more worryingly, to distort the GPS signal across much of Scandinavia. Now, a vivid indication of the scale of their modernisation is clear from a 3-minute video clip I'm now going to show you. This was run on Russian TV a couple of years ago. You don't need to understand the Russian, just simply listen to the tone of the commentary. But the key point is that what you will see is all new stuff, and the 2017 State Armaments Plan shows that even more has followed since this.
Долгое время нас не воспринимали всерьез. Служба считалась уделом дураков, которые не смогли откосить. У нас была устаревшая техника и вооружение. В армии не учили воевать. Отныне все будет иначе. До 2020 года Россия потратит на перевооружение армии более 20 триллионов рублей. Будет создана новая межконтинентальная баллистическая ракета, которая заменит знаменитую «Сатану». Новая ракета будет способна прорывать любые существующие и перспективные потенциального противника. Некоторые рода войск, например, зенитные ракетные войска ВВС России, в техническом плане будут обновлены на 100%. До 2020 года будут построены 8 стратегических атомных подводных лодок проекта 955 «Борей», 2 из которых уже готовы к принятию на вооружение. Ведется разработка нового стратегического бомбардировщика, технический проект которого будет окончательно сформирован к 2015 году. В рамках развития стратегических ядерных сил будет произведено укрепление наземной ракетной группировки и модернизацию стратегической авиации. 2 дальних бомбардировщиков. Будет укреплена и расширена система предупреждения о ракетном нападении. Проведено развертывание новых систем космического базирования, которые будут заниматься обнаружением стартов баллистических ракет. В военно-воздушные войска поступит более 600 самолетов и 1000 вертолетов. Военные летчики получат новые истребители, фронтовые бомбардировщики и штурмовики, а также транспортники. Военным будут переданы новые ударные вертолеты серии Ми-28 и К-52, а также транспортные и транспортно-боевые Ми-8 и Ми-26. Войска воздушно-космической обороны получат 10 дивизионных зенитно-ракетных комплексов С-500. Кроме того, зенитные ракетные войска пополнятся 56 дивизионами ЗРК С-400. Военно-морские силы России получат 100 надводных и подводных кораблей, включая 20 нестратегических подводных лодок, 35 корветов и 15 фрегатов. Сухопутные войска получат новые танки «Армата» и артиллерийские установки «Коалиция СВ», не имеющие аналогов в мире. Уже сейчас наши стратегические ракетоносцы возобновили постоянное боевое дежурство в небе. Уже сейчас наши подводные лодки месяцами скрыто находятся под самым носом у берегов США. Уже сейчас наши сухопутные войска постоянно отрабатывают на учениях всевозможные сценарии любых конфликтов и успешно применяют полученные знания на практике. Армия России. Мы вернулись.
Now, of course, we have to accept that this is information warfare at its best, but I think you would agree it's an eye-watering quantity of capability. Now, the other part of the threat is how one assesses intent. Now, I'm not in any way going to suggest that Russia wants to go to war in the traditional definition of the term, but there are factors that bear on the question of intent, and one needs to understand Russian psyche, their culture, and their philosophy of preemption. Russia, I think, could initiate hostilities sooner than we expect, and a lot earlier than we would in similar circumstances. Most likely, they will use nefarious, sub-NATO Article 5 treaty actions to erode the capability of NATO and threaten the very structure that provides our own defence and security. This is the divide and rule which the international order is designed to prevent. I don't think it will start with little green men. It will start with something we don't expect. We should not take what we've seen so far as a template for the future. And there will be some who might ask, if Russia sees itself in decline and more able now to go to war than in the future, does this encourage them to think of war? Perhaps compare the situation today to 1912, when the Russian Imperial Cabinet assessed that it would be better to fight now because by 1925 Russia would be too weak in comparison to a modernised Germany. And Japan, of course, drew similar conclusions in 1941. And Russia worries, I think, that the West will achieve a technological offset in the next decade. I suspect, though, that the greatest risk is the risk of miscalculation. The recent false alert in Hawaii that warned of an incoming missile is an indication of how easy it would be to miscalculate, particularly when the level of militarization is significant. And we saw this only too vividly with the downing of flight MH17 over Ukraine in 2014. Speaking recently, William Perry, Secretary of Defence under Bill Clinton, who is all too familiar with false alerts, having been awakened by a call from a night watch officer in 1979 and thought he was about to experience the Holocaust. And of course, he also presided over the dismantlement of nuclear weapons in the 1990s. He warned that the threat is back. I quote, "Because the US and Russia today are confronting each other with a hostility that's recreating the geopolitical dangers of the Cold War, and because US and Russia are rebuilding their nuclear arsenals, that's recreating the military dangers of the Cold War." Now, you can argue about the extent to which the Kremlin's disinformation efforts have influenced various Western countries, but the main impact has been to convince ordinary Russians that the West is a threat. We've been made to appear as the enemy, whether we like it or not, and whatever the real situation. Moreover, we, on our side, don't have the same level of understanding that we had of each other in the Cold War. And the tried and tested systems and diplomatic instruments are not what they once were. Confidence-building measures, arms reduction negotiations, public monitoring and inspection of each other's military activity, etc. So when the ante was upped following the Russian intervention in Ukraine, conversation became difficult. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be like that. We now have to worry not about a symmetric playing field, as one saw in the Cold War, but an asymmetric one in which there are far more players. So we should not assume that events in the Pacific wouldn't draw more US attention than those in Europe. And we, I think, should be careful of complacency. The parallels with 1914 are stark. Our generation has become used to wars of choice since the end of the Cold War. But we may not have a choice about conflict with Russia. And we should remember Trotsky's dictum that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. So, what should we be doing differently? First of all, I think we should recognise that Russia respects strength and people who stand up to them. The original plan for Ukraine had been to acquire significantly more terrain. However, Russia was surprised by Ukrainian resistance and had to settle for less. We should identify Russian weaknesses and then manoeuvre asymmetrically against them. First of all, perhaps we should be in the business of building real institutional capacity in neighbouring states so that they have the strength and confidence to stand up to Russia and the internal resilience to withstand pressures designed to bring them down from within. We should be making more progress on reducing energy dependency on Russia. We should be telling the Russian population what's really going on. We should be protecting our critical capabilities, hence the importance of cyber. And we should be looking to identify our own vulnerabilities to Russian malign influence and disinformation and act to reduce them. Next, I think we need to demonstrate our preparedness to commit. Boots on the ground is not a positive term at the moment. But our allies on NATO's eastern flank absolutely appreciate that a platoon of infantry is worth a squadron of F-16s when it comes to commitment. The importance we attach to alliance cohesion, that's vital to us. That is our centre of gravity. And hence I think the words that were in SDSR 15 about international by design are absolutely right. And everything the British Army is doing at the moment is to work out how it can implement international by design. We recognise that our communication systems have to be extrovert so that our allies can plug into them. Hence the vital importance of interoperability. And by interoperability, our priorities are to be able to communicate securely, but at a NATO mission secret level, not a UK-only level. It's important to have shared situational awareness and to be able to control fires digitally in support of each other. For me, therefore, the ability to bring into service a new form of land environment tactical communications is vital. And our relationship with the UK IT sector to deliver this is also vital. But it's also vital that our human relationships are maximised. And for example, the combined engineering regiment that we share with the Bundeswehr, based in Minden in Germany, is a very good example of how you can burden share and deliver more capability through a pairing and a partnership like that, as indeed we do with our French allies through the CJEF. Next, I think we've got to continue to work at improving NATO. We have to recognise that readiness is about speed of recognition, speed of decision-making, and speed of assembly. I'll say that again. It's about speed of recognition, it's about speed of decision-making, and it's about speed of assembly. Now, our contributions to the very high readiness Joint Task Force land in NATO and the enhanced forward presence deployed, in our case, partly in Poland, but more in Estonia, are starting points. And they are good ways also of multinational development in terms of our French involvement in one and Danes in the other. Now, they are a starting point because I would suggest that we need the ability to reinforce them rapidly and to be able to outmaneuver the potential anti-access area denial missile dome that will be put in place as we seek to reinforce them. We therefore need, I would suggest, to be able to deploy overland, by road and by rail. And our strike concept seeks to project land capability over distances of up to some 2,000 kilometres. Now, it brings with it good questions about logistics, sustainability and communications, as well as combat and combat service support. However, we're testing it at the moment through a programme of experimentation, and we're learning very good lessons. For example, we are copying what the Germans did very well in 1940, when all of their prime movers, in terms of their tanks and armoured vehicles, had trailers. And by doing that, it reduces your logistic tail. Those sorts of old-fashioned lessons brought forward are definitely improving our ability to deploy. And we will test this concept by driving to the NATO exercise Trident Juncture, which is taking place in Norway this autumn. It's also important, I think, to stress the needs for a forward mounting base, and therefore we are actively examining the retention of our infrastructure in Germany, where we store our vehicles in Ayrshire Barracks in Rheindahlen and our training facilities in Sennelager, as well as our heavy equipment transporters that are based there and our stockpiling and ammunition storage. Next, I think it's important, go back to my point of speed of recognition and speed of decision-making, that we give policymakers the opportunity to exercise with military leaders, as we did during the Cold War. This goes to the heart of speed of recognition. It goes back to the point about it won't be little green men next time. And when you think about how difficult it is in this era of constant competition, where there is this grey area between peace and war, the first hostile act is going to be very difficult to recognise. And when, as a young officer, I sat in my trench on the West German plain, it was very clear to me what that first hostile act would have looked like. And I always imagined a soldier from the Soviet Union with wire cutters cutting the fence before his tank drove through it. It's not going to be like that next time. So how we educate and train our policymakers in making the decision that they might need to make is vital. And I think to do all of this, we need to return to an annual or biennial NATO exercise rhythm in which all levels play, from the grand strategic level to the tactical level. This would allow for our resources to be properly targeted and for frontline countries to practice mobilisation and indeed allow us to exercise on train and private land and to understand some of the constraints associated with choke points and bridges and railway traffic and all that goes with it. Next, I think we need to prepare ourselves to fight the war we might have to fight. I think it's an important point, because in being prepared to fight the war we might have to fight, there's a sporting chance that we will prevent it from happening. And I think the 100th anniversary of World War I gives us a great chance to actually think about what that war might look like. Therefore, in the Army at the moment, we have a project underway styled as Project Henry Wilson. For the historians amongst you, you will know that Henry Wilson was the Major General who was the Director of Military Operations in 1914, who was able to pull a mobilisation plan off the shelf and send the British Expeditionary Force to Flanders. Now, being able to do that again, I think, is important. It's important so that we understand what our equipment can do, and it's important to understand where we maximise the potential of all of our manpower. And that's why we have invested significant effort in a reserve component, but increasingly also in a regular reserve component. Now, I hasten to add that our reserve component is not a substitute for the regular component, but it's the means to augment it with particularly specialists, and there's much that we're doing in drawing that talent from the medical area, from cyber, and from information warfare. But it's also, of course, about augmenting with mass, and that recognises that the regular component has never been as small as this, probably since Napoleonic times. And what it also does for us is to provide the basis for regeneration and reconstitution. I've been very impressed with the talent that's come forward to join the Army Reserve, particularly on what we call Group B terms of service. In our 77 Brigade, which I shall come back to, we've got some remarkable talent when it comes to social media, production design, and indeed Arabic poetry. Those sorts of skills we can't afford to retain in the regular component, but they are the means of us delivering capability in a much more imaginative way than we might have been able to do in the past. We now have over 30,000 on the books in terms of the reserve, and they are available to deploy with the regular component if they have got the time and their employers can release them whenever they want to. Now, turning to the regular reserve, potentially we have some 25 to 30,000 who would make up the regular reserve. This recognises that 50% of the army leaves before the age of 30. Hence, much of them are young and well qualified, with, of course, a statutory liability to be available for mobilisation. The trick is in retaining contact with this force, and we are working at the moment through the data protection issues to make sure that we reinforce that. The goal, I think, will be to build on a pilot that we ran last year and to conduct a full-blown mobilisation exercise for all of the reserve and the regular reserve, just like we used to do in the Cold War, sometime in the middle of next year. Now, as part of this, we will clearly place a priority in the regular reserve on scarce capabilities, like, for example, attack helicopter pilots. But it is definitely a means of maximising the potential of all of the manpower that we have, and it would potentially deliver a total armed force of nearer 140,000 post-mobilisation. Now, quite clearly, if we're going to do this, we need to have some support from the policy level through employers to the general public as a whole. But I think people can understand that perhaps for a day a year, it is logical to be able to retain this capability. Next observation I'd make is that we need to be able to fight differently against the sorts of threats that I've set out there. First of all, we need reversionary skills to counter the threat against our software and our communication systems, and potentially having the GPS system taken down. Good old night navigation and map reading that I was brought up doing should clearly be a feature of what we're talking about here. Next, we've got to be able to fight more dispersed, with the ability to concentrate rapidly to achieve the mass you need. Next, we've got to invest in junior leadership. Hence, I talk much about maximising talent. I talk about our command philosophy that enables initiative and tactical adaptation at the lowest levels, and absent further orders, enables people to seize the initiative. It's why we are investing in a brains-based general staff to challenge, to think flexibly, and to place a premium on adaptability, recognising, of course, that when we go to war, we definitely won't get it right on day one, and it is that sense of adaptability and agility which will give us a chance to prevail. And finally, in terms of fighting differently, we need to recognise that how and where we train and who we train with should be a surrogate for warfare as well, given the nature of messaging that comes in this era of constant competition that I described. And then last, in terms of how we should do things differently, we need to acknowledge that we have some capability issues that have to be addressed. I think first we have to recognise that deterrence needs a set of graduated responses to enable escalation. And that means that for me, as the CGS, it's important that I recapitalise much of the Army's equipment. You have to go back to 1985 in the era of General Bagnall, the last time that we had a major recapitalisation programme. And the capabilities that we see now, the Challenger tank, the Warrior armoured fighting vehicle, the attack helicopter, multi-launch rocket systems, and the AS-90 self-propelled artillery system, were all systems that came in under him and under his thinking, with his concepts at the front end of it. And of course, what has happened over the last 15 years is we've been focused on counterinsurgency and stabilisation. And by the end of the Afghan campaign of combat operations, we were a very well-equipped army for that particular task. Our challenge now is to leap forward to what we need, given the threats that I've described. Now, I sense that involves upgrading our armoured infantry capability. We're looking at active protection, more lethality and greater range for our Challenger tank. We're looking at upgrading our Warrior armoured vehicle. We're looking at maximising the potential of the Ajax vehicle. So it looks like a medium tank that's entering service at the moment. And in due course, bringing into service a mechanised infantry vehicle to complement it. This will be transformational for the British Army and will get us to manoeuvre in a very different way and to project power over land in a different way. We need to improve our ISTAR capability, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance, to be able to target deep fires, because we have got to revert to an era when we are able to focus on the enemy's uncommitted forces, the so-called deep battle that we soldiers talk about. But whilst we're doing that, to protect ourselves from the air and from inbound missiles. And I touched on connectivity. We must invest in our ability to communicate and to share information through a new land environment tactical CIS system. We also, though, need to continue to improve our ability to fight on this new battlefield. And I think it's important that we build on the excellent foundation that we've created for information warfare through our 77 Brigade, which is now giving us the capability to compete in the war of narratives at the tactical level. And as David Patrikarakos put it in his recently published book, War in 140 Characters, in which he observes on the war in Ukraine, I was caught up in two wars. One fought on the ground with tanks and artillery, and an information war fought largely, though not exclusively, through social media. And counterintuitively, it mattered more who won the war of words and narratives than who had the most potent weaponry. He also observed that social media is throwing up digital supermen, hyper-connected and hyper-empowered online individuals. And I'd like a few of those in 77 Brigade, please. So, in sum, I have inevitably looked at this through a land prism, but you should recognise that what I'm describing is part of a joint force. So, to conclude, I believe our ability to preempt or respond to these threats will be eroded if we don't match up to them now. They represent a clear and present danger. They are not thousands of miles away. They are now on Europe's doorstep. And the character of warfare is making it much harder for us to recognise true intentions and thus distinguish between what is peace and what is war. Of course, it doesn't have to be like this, but we cannot afford to sit back. We need to recognise that credible deterrence must be underpinned by genuine capability and genuine commitment that earns the respect of potential opponents. Thank you very much.
General Sunic, thank you very much indeed for that very rich presentation, and I think it gave us a really great flavour for the transformation on which the Army is embarking, and I think a real sense that we're actually at an early stage of that transformation after that long period of focusing counterinsurgency. I remember, many of us will remember, countless debates in this room about counterinsurgency warfare and getting that right. And very striking, I think, in your presentation that, although you made a few initial remarks in terms of the continuing problems of instability in Europe's southern neighbourhood, nevertheless, the bulk of your remarks were focusing on the challenges of state-to-state deterrence, particularly, though not only in relation to Russia. I certainly learnt a considerable amount. Very interesting, I think, your discussion of the importance of international by design as a concept, but also addressing, I think, quite frankly, some of the gaps that you perceive in terms of the Army's ability to operate effectively against capable states such as Russia, and how we need to address those, and not least, I think, also the strategic picture in terms of the potential for conflict. War with Russia is something which we clearly want to avoid, not at all costs, but we do want to avoid if at all possible, and that requires effective deterrence and credible armed forces for ourselves and our allies. Now, we've got some time for discussion and Q&A, and I'd like to, if I may, ask our former Director General, Michael Clark, to make the first contribution. Michael, are you available?
Never backward if somebody puts a microphone in my hand. No, thank you. CGS, thank you for that speech, which I have to say had an edge of urgency to it and great strategic coherence, which is extremely welcome. I guess my tactical question really is in terms of the ability to deploy a combat division, particularly the strike brigades. How worried are you that they may be vulnerable to air attack? Or how happy are you that they can be properly defended? Because there's a danger, of course, that when you need the heavy metal, nothing else will do. But if the heavy metal is vulnerable in an old-fashioned way, then it doesn't matter how much cyber and C4I star we have. If the heavy metal isn't there when it's needed, then we lose. And that must be exercising you as you think through the reform of the forces in the way that you have.
No, thank you, and absolutely it does. Of course, we've had the luxury over the last 15 years of counterinsurgency not to really have to worry about the threat from the air at all. I mean, there have been the odd drone attack, but in principle, we've not had to worry about it at all. And we now find ourselves in considering the sorts of threats that I've been describing in an environment where the odds on achieving air superiority are going to be much more challenging than they once were. But of course, it's not just air superiority, it's about the threat of missiles. And the vividness, I think, of the video I showed, wind the clock forward to the quantities that I was then talking about, I think tells us that how we prevent ourselves from being taken out on day one on the basis of electronic warfare, prompting drone attacks, which then deliver these very frightening arrays of missiles, is something that is significantly challenging for us. An investment in ballistic missile defense, the sorts of training and doctrinal adjustments that I was talking about doing in terms of dispersal, and then, of course, getting back to understanding ground-based air defense is vital. And, of course, it's exercising the Chief of the Air Staff as well, because what they have done for the last 15 years has been very much focused on close air support and the counterinsurgency outcomes that they've been seeking to achieve. And the sort of environment that we all understood when we were growing up in the 70s and the 80s is an environment that the new generation has not had the opportunity to be exposed to. So there's a lot there, I think, that we need to reflect on and draw deductions from.
Dr. Isle at the back.
Jonathan Isle from here, from the Institute. I appreciate that this is a sort of a partly a political decision, but the existing conflicts that we do have and have encountered with the Russians, don't you think that we surrendered escalation dominance or accepted Russia's escalation dominance far too quickly? Would it not, with hindsight, have been better to supply lethal equipment to the Ukrainian armed forces? And is this not an option that could be exercised today? Namely, in the subject of escalation dominance, have we not surrendered far too early and far too willingly?
Well, I mean, I think the straight answer to your question is, of course, there's a political dimension to it. I mean, as a military officer, I think one has to be very careful about over-militarizing a problem, because that brings with it the risk of miscalculation, as I was alluding to. But I do think it's more about how you develop institutions. And I think that the real value that our army can offer, and our armed forces, and for that matter, NATO armies as well, is in the development of people's institutions, so that they become robust states that are able to resist the problems from within, but also to provide a vivid defense from outside. And I think that's really where the effort needs to go, in my own military opinion. In terms of escalation dominance, I think we're realizing the challenge we've now got, and that's what, in a sense, I was talking to. And of course, that needs to be a balance of capabilities in this environment we've described. And of course, Russia does this well with its conventional, unconventional, and nuclear domains well integrated together.
Admiral Lord West, in the front row.
General Nick, thank you very much. I share your view and concerns on the threat and the need to change in the way you're talking about. However, you're talking about recapitalization, you talk of ballistic missile defense, you talk of new tactical comms systems on the battlefield, a whole raft of things that you're talking about. Presumably, you're quite happy you're going to be able to do all those things, and we're going to be able to come out of this all bright and rosy. You've not made any mention of what I'd call the elephant in the room, which is that actually we seem to be very short of money at the moment in all areas. And I'd be interested to know, are you quite happy that going ahead that you're going to be able to achieve these things? Or do you think there is a very, very real problem unless somehow, I mean, I think you mentioned a sense of a genuine capability and genuine commitment. Do you believe there's genuine commitment from the government in terms of money to actually achieve this?
No, thank you. As you well know, the National Security Capability Review is underway, and I think you also know, as I alluded to it, that the defence strand of it is going on for a bit longer. And I wouldn't wish to second-guess what deductions are drawn from that and how that changes things. But I think that's the place in which the discussion needs to take place. I mean, what I do as a military chief, and you did the same as the First Sea Lord, is to make the case for your capability, and neither of us as service chiefs would ever not argue for more. What we have to do is to be old and wise enough to recognise that there will be other priorities, that there's a bigger picture, and that once the argument has been had, we deal with the means that's available to us, and we get on and make the best of what we've got. And as a service chief, that is what I have done throughout my 3 years at CGS, but I'm always there to try and argue for more.
Now, CGS, since the number of hands going up is multiplying, as it always does after about 5 minutes, I'll take them in bundles of 2 or 3, if I may. Gentleman here, and then Deborah Haynes, please.
Good afternoon. Tim Ripley from Jane Smith's Weekly Magazine. Every time I see you at a conference, I ask you about upgrading our Challenger tanks. It seems now that tank program we've got is not going to deliver an upgraded tank until 2024, 2025 at the earliest, which, given you raise the prospect of the Russians being able to attack at almost no notice, we have troops in Challenger tanks in Estonia as we speak, and warrior vehicles and all sorts of things which are obsolete compared to what the Russians have got. Is it not time to start thinking about using a UOR process to fast-track all those upgrades to the vehicles of the troops who are in the front line, so they're not tethered goats ready to be slaughtered, so they have proper kit that can really take on the opponents, and worry about equipping the rest of the army at a later date?
And pass it along, could you pass it along, please?
Deborah Haynes from The Times. Could you give a sense of the uplift that the Ministry of Defence would like to see in terms of the sort of financial settlement from the Treasury each year? Thanks.
And where are... yes, this gentleman here, yeah.
The British Army has largely focused upon small wars against non-state-based asymmetric threats, as you refer to in your at the opening moments of your address. These attract a lot of public attention, yet there's not a lot of sort of, focus on Russia. And when we do focus upon defence issues, which is primarily against sub-state threats, the general view of people, correctly, is that our armed forces, that conventional power cannot defeat them. Do you think this creates an issue of public perception which affects policymakers?
If you'd like to come back to those three, and then we'll take some more.
Yes, I'll start with the tank. I think the first observation I'd make is that we have confidence in the tank and the warrior vehicle as they're deployed in Estonia at the moment. We acknowledge that they're going to need upgrading at some stage during the next 5 years. We're quite clear on that. But I think what we'd also observe is that they're going to be used with other capabilities in an integrated way, particularly with air power, but also with the attack helicopter. And when you link all of these capabilities together, you get a much greater effect than the sum of the parts might indicate. And that's why we have a programme underway at the moment, which is in a successful assessment phase, which is looking at 2 different options for how that tank will be upgraded. And it's my expectation that that will deliver the sort of capability that we need within the time frame that we require it. And I'm reasonably confident of that. And I'm also confident that we will have the same with Warrior. I think you then have to ask yourself, going back to the opponent, the extent to which he is able to field the sorts of capabilities that have the potential to overmatch that tank in the short term. And I suspect that at the moment the thing is reasonably balanced. And we wouldn't be deploying post-Chilcot our soldiers to the sorts of environments that they might get into trouble in if we didn't have confidence in the capabilities that we were giving them to deploy with. Picking up in Deborah's point about defence expenditure, again, I don't know the answer to your question because I think it is totally wound up in the National Security Capability Review and how the defence line of that goes ahead. I mean, we do know that at the moment defence expenditure is rising by 0.5% in real terms year on year, which of course which is a reassuring place to be in relation to the rate of inflation. And we know that they've set it at 2% of GDP. And that's a good enough assumption for the moment. What we've now got to do is to have the debate in the context of the NSCR about what the requirement is. And I feel sure that when we get to the point when decisions are made, we will have had a decent debate. I didn't really understand your question. I'm sorry. I was perhaps being a bit of a dough bag.
Just wait till the microphone.
British armed forces have fought 2 small wars in Iraq and Afghanistan with what a lot of people on the street say a very serious lack of success. How can British armed forces, how can we make the justification for protecting us, for redeveloping our armed forces to fight against the Russians, when our armed forces have been discredited in the public's eye via the controversial war on terror? What lessons does the war on terror have on that Russian situation?
Well, I think I would take issue with your comment that we weren't successful. I think you have to gauge that at the strategic, the operational and the tactical level. And I think if you spoke to any British soldier who'd been engaged in the tactical battlefield that was Helmand, he would observe that he was never defeated. And I think we also have to recognise that they did so with significant bravery, significant courage, and that the level of tactical adaptation that that battle represented was truly impressive. And the way in which the nation got behind those soldiers on the ground, in terms of how they equipped them, how they looked after them, and more importantly, the amount of charity that went into those that were wounded, was a truly impressive event. Now, in terms of the politics of it, it's far too early to conclude whether Afghanistan has been successful or not. It's a campaign that continues. It's a campaign that I've spent nearly 3 years of my life closely involved in. And there are some good things that are going on. So I would say it is far too early for you to judge whether or not it's successful or not at the strategic level. So when it comes to how we pitch ourselves against a threat that is a near or peer threat like Russia, we didn't do a bad job in the Cold War as an army, integrated into NATO. And we should remind ourselves that all of this is done as an alliance. And when you add up the total effect that the alliance delivers in conventional terms, also in nuclear terms for that matter, the answer is that I think we should reassure ourselves that we're not on our own doing all of this, and that the British Army still represents a reference customer status that many of my opposite numbers as chiefs of staffs of European armies look at with envy. And that, I think, is a good place for us to be.
Very good. Over here, please.
Hi, Laura Makin-Ishwood from British Forces Broadcasting Service. A number of people in recent weeks have said that they feel that actually civil servants in the Treasury have more control over how we're deciding we push against sort of future threats than you do or other military chiefs. Where do you sit on that? Do you agree with them? Do you feel like you should have more of a say on how we spend our money in the defence budget?
And then here, please.
Sorry, General, many thanks. I'm sure others will draw you back to talking about Russia, but I wondered whether you might give a few comments on your strategic assessment of the light footprint operations that currently characterise much of British military engagement. We've seen a shift in recent years away from the UK deploying large numbers of ground forces towards working more by, with and through local partners, providing support, advice and assistance. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about how that's going in terms of a model for confronting some of the threats that you raised towards the beginning of your speech in terms of international terrorism, and were there any lessons learned or risks identified for the UK in this sort of approach, given that it looks like those problems aren't going to be going away anytime soon? Many thanks.
And then, gentleman in the front.
John Ingham, Daily Express. I just wondered if you've shown your Russian video to the Treasury.
Yes, and then the gentleman in the middle here.
Thank you. I'm Ben Glaze from the Daily Mirror. I'm just wondering if you think, in the light of Iraq and Afghanistan, if as a country and governments have lost the stomach for a fight to deploy ground troops.
And finally, James Gray over here.
General James Gray House of Commons. Can I ask you a little bit about the process? I think that was the first time we've actually had officially confirmed that the defence strand is going to be treated separately from the rest of the review, item 1. Does that mean effectively what we have is a full defence review rather than a security review? Will it be conducted by the MOD or by the Cabinet Office? And what do you think of Sir Mark Sidwell's view that the current review is fiscally neutral? Will your review also be fiscally neutral? In other words, will there be no more money spent, or will you be able to come to conclusions that will demand higher government spending?
Well, those are 4 very straightforward questions.
What do they say about if you can't take the heat? I'll deal with that one first, if I may. I'm sorry if I implied that it was separate from the NSCR. What I hope I said was that the defence strand of the National Security Capability Review was running on for longer. I didn't in any way say it was separate. So I think that probably answers your question. How long it takes, I don't know, but I think that you will hear quite soon how it will be handled, and I'm not going to go further than that, if I may. Which sort of segs into whether we should have more say in how we spend our money. Actually, I think I do have quite a lot of say in how we spend our money. I mean, one of the most stimulating and energising things that occurred when I took over CGS was Lord Levine's reforms cutting in and the delegation of the budget down to me as a service chief and the 10-year forward programme. And come the 1st of April this coming year, we will receive the infrastructure money as well, which will give us all of the different resource components of our programme. Now, actually, I find that very empowering because it gives me the opportunity and the absolute responsibility to work out how to spend the money I've got for the best possible effect in terms of capability. And I absolutely get listened to by the Ministry of Defence in terms of how I suggest I should spend that. And indeed, if I'm short of money, there is a sensible debate about how that can be handled. So I think that within defence, I feel I have a voice. And I also have the right of redress to levels above defence as a service chief if I need them. That has not occurred, but I think I know I have that right. So I think my voice is absolutely heard. And I also think that post the Chilcot report, we all feel, as service chiefs, a sense of responsibility and duty to hold people to account if we feel that we don't have what we need. And that's an empowering and, I think, a stimulating place to be. I haven't shown the video to the Treasury. I'm glad you liked it. Copies are available on the internet. It's very straightforward. But I'll spend a bit more time, if I may, on the other 2 questions. No, I don't think that policymakers or the British population have lost the stomach for a fight. I think the point is if the cause is seen as a really, really important cause, then the British people always get behind that cause. And of course, what we all have to do is to make the case for the cause. And that's one of the reasons why I'm speaking today, because I think it's important that we make the case for the cause. And I absolutely know that our country has always stood up and been counted when it needed to. And we've seen that repeatedly through history. And I'm in no doubt that we will do exactly the same thing again, from the very top to the very bottom. And on by, with and through, I think this is a very interesting area. And it's something that the Army 2020 proposition that I helped design got after. Because we fundamentally feel that the idea of being persistently engaged overseas, building indigenous capability, and developing the appropriate insight and understanding to deliver an effect is something that we should routinely be doing. I think it's a big lesson that we learnt from the Iraq and Afghan campaigns. And I often quote from Antonio Gustozzi, who said, every age has its follies. The folly of our age has been an irresistible desire to change the world without first studying and understanding it. So I think the notion of being persistently engaged overseas, operating in the way that you describe is important to us. And indeed, one of the structural adjustments that were made in SDSR 15 and are now being implemented is this idea of having 4 infantry battalions in our structure, which will become specialised infantry. And they are battalions that are longer on leaders and shorter on soldiers, so they have more experience to be able to structure themselves to operate embedded within indigenous forces, to train, develop them, and importantly to understand culture and to speak language and to be able to take perhaps slightly greater risk in terms of the way in which they're employed. And I think that initiative is a good example of how we recognise that the thing's moved on. And we see that in Iraq at the moment. So I would say it's a very positive development.
Very good. Thank you very much. Please here, Robert Fox.
Robert Fox, generally. I was very interested that you concentrated very heavily on Russia and for very obvious reasons, and you explained that extremely articulately. I think you hardly mentioned China once. I've just been at a conference in Venice, an international conference of defense and strategic and foreign journalists, where one of the premises was that China is now a European power through the activities of the New Silk Road and all that there obtains. And of course, that was the city of Marco Polo that we were in. But the serious point is how, in your assessments, in your councils, amongst your debates with your staff, are you considering this marriage of convenience of China and Russia, and particularly the superiority that seems to be worrying Americans now that they may have in mainstream aspects of cyber offence and warfare?
Thank you. And right at the back. There's a hand up right at the back, I think. Please.
Thank you, General. Ed Butler, former soldier. You put a lot of emphasis on the threat about hybrid warfare and the Russians and other actors using all lines of activity to take down our capabilities. What's the balance of your investment, of your thinking towards more hybrid activity and engaging more hybrid lines which are available to the state? And secondly, I didn't hear you mention the role of the private sector in really stepping up in maybe unconventional means, i.e. outside defence, technology and security companies.
And there's a gentleman right over here at the back.
General James Glancy, a member of RUSI. I was at a talk at a government ministry the other day talking about the foreign aid budget and DFID, and rather than criticising it, was saying actually one of the main problems is the lack of teeth and risk that they're prepared to take, and the lack of boots on the ground from the department. Is there scope for the army or the armed forces to take on more of an aid role using defence budget resources, but to get on the ground into countries where we're not, in order to advance the use of aid where we are spending money but we don't actually know where it's going?
And the lady in front.
Brown from the Daily Mail. If the Chancellor does give you more money, where will you invest it first? Will it be in ballistic missile defence? Thanks very much.
And I'm going to give Pete Quentin the last word. Pete? Microphone will be with you in a second.
Peter Quentin, RUSI. Just to finish with a soft one, if I might, General. A lot of time we talk about what we want, expect, need from the Army and those who lead it. What is it that you want or don't want, perhaps, from us, defences, chattering classes, the media and wider society?
General, would you like to answer those questions which you feel best equipped to answer?
Thanks. Yes, indeed. Well, I'll start with the one that I'm least well equipped to answer, which is I don't think that we necessarily, Robert, regard China as a clear and present threat at the moment. Turning to hybrid effort and the role of the private sector, the question that Ed Butler asked. In terms of hybridity, I think that we are working hard on how we might create what we're describing as an information manoeuvre formation at the moment. And what we want to do is to build on the success of our information warfare brigade, the 77th Brigade, connect it to our ISTAR brigade, and connect it to our two signals brigades to create, if you like, an integrated whole which will dominate the information space and will give us the ability to play in the maintaining and changing of people's behaviours through non-kinetic means. And this is an experimental idea. We've pulled the thing together in structural terms. And I think what we're learning is that that information manoeuvre, combined with ground manoeuvre, combined with air manoeuvre, is providing, and I emphasise this, at the tactical level, so the bit that I'm competent to talk about as the head of the army, I think some really quite interesting opportunities, which I think will play out very successfully on the sorts of battlefields that we envisage the next decade to push up. And in terms of how the private sector plays into that, we have a very open mind. I think we're very clear that some of the by, with and through, the capacity building that I described in answer to a previous question, would definitely benefit from a connection to industry and the way in which that can work. And I think we also absolutely recognise that when you look at the proportion of the private sector deployed on the ground in support of American forces in Afghanistan, it's almost 1/3 to 2/3. You'd be absolutely mad if you didn't avail yourselves of the innovation, investment, and more importantly, capability that industry can provide. And I think that that is something that we absolutely feel we need to invest in. The trick, of course, is creating the right commercial framework in which this can happen. And that's a long question which we probably haven't got time to answer this afternoon. Perhaps it goes into the question that was posed about the role of the military in support of DFID and how that plays out in delivering aid. I mean, I think that we learnt a lot about our relationship in interagency terms and intergovernmental department terms from the operation in Sierra Leone to deal with the Ebola problem. And I think what was very striking about that was that a DFID lead, with us providing the organisational framework and much of the resources that were necessary to get after the problem, was a very successful means of working together on the ground. And I think that that's the way I would prefer that we operated, where we provide a complementary effect, playing to each other's strengths, and being very prepared to be led by those who are leading on the basis of aid-related outcomes. So to my mind, that's the model I think we should pursue. And it's a model that we've used quite successfully in Afghanistan, but I think that's probably the best example that I have. Then I think I was asked where we would invest more if the Chancellor was generous. Again, that's not really my choice, unfortunately. I'm sure I'd be able to represent very good arguments around the Chiefs of Staff table, but it'll be a decision that is taken collectively, and we'll see what happens. And then finally, what do I want from all of you? My purpose in coming to speak to you this evening was to create and inspire a debate. And I think all I would ask is that we have a debate. All I would ask is that we try and put the issues of the armed forces and defence more broadly and the security of our nation out there and continue to have the conversation. Because in having the conversation, we will discover whether the man and woman in the street is interested in all of this. And I think that's the honest thing that we should do. And if we think about the sorts of debates that were underway during the Cold War, those are the sorts of debates that I think we need to encourage now. So I would ask you to contribute to the debate and put your head above the parapet. Thank you very much.
General, on behalf of us all here, I'd like to thank you for your frankness, your knowledge, and the depth of experience you bring to your presentation and answers to our questions today. It reflects very well, I think, on yourself, but also on the Army as a whole. We all here rely on a strong, agile, adaptable Army for our security, and will continue to do so in a world which is changing rapidly before our eyes. And I think we all actually share the objective you just put before us, which certainly RUSI feels quite passionately about, that we have to have a debate on these really important issues that is evidence-based, that as a result of really vigorous debate, but above all is a shared commitment to enhancing our nation's security in the years ahead. So thank you very much indeed, and I hope it will not be too long before we see you back at RUSI. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, very much.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, thank you.